My name is Tim, and I am finally giving a non-programming talk. This talk is called Design, Doubt, and the Scientific Method, and it's about game design process. So a while back, I joined a game company as a programmer, and I fell into this really lucky situation where I pitched a game to the company like shortly after joining, and they actually let me make it. And this was the first game that I was a designer on, and I didn't really understand this at the time, but the development process was very unusual in that the design in my head turned out to be very close to the final product. So the game was pretty small, but it was significant for me because it was my first project. And I totally came out of development feeling like I was hot shit. And I hadn't been hired to do design work, but I decided I really wanted to do more, and I did. But after this first project, essentially every game I worked on as a designer for the next several years involved a lot of really unpleasant stress. And I realized that I realized after the fact, essentially, that I had fallen into this pattern where I'd concept and pitch a game, and then I'd knock out some prototypes, which would be shitty and broken in the ways that prototypes are. And I would always start to feel after the second or third prototype iteration like I needed to have the design, the answers to every design problem raised by that prototype. And if I didn't have all the answers, which I never had, I would literally lay in bed at night and obsess over them. And essentially just, sort of like drive myself crazy a little bit until I was done working on that particular game. So fast forward a little bit in this story, and it's about 18 months ago from today. I left my job to work on my own games, and I also decided that uncertainty during the design process is inevitable, and that I wanted to be a bit less fragile and delicate when it comes to coping with that uncertainty. And so this talk is basically about where I've arrived, and it is so basic that I am almost embarrassed to be talking about it, and I sort of hesitated to give it, but it basically boils down to trust the prototyping process. But it turns out that in my case at least, and perhaps for somebody else, it's been really useful for me to frame prototyping and iteration in terms of the scientific method. So this is basically how I have started thinking about the design iteration process. Each prototype you make is essentially a set of hypotheses, right? A simple prototype is comprised of a bunch of different ideas. And each of those ideas is essentially a hypothesis. It's you saying, I think that this is a way to make an idea in my head work. So you prototype as quickly as you can, of course, and then you subject your prototype to an experiment, to a playtest, which is essentially an experiment where you're seeing how those hypotheses hold up to real life, and more specifically, you discover what is working and what is not. And in early prototypes, this is almost always like what is failing horribly and what is failing a little bit less horribly, but essentially like each prototype is sort of like going through this experimentation process. Then you analyze the results of your playtest, and you use that analysis to modify your hypothesis. Then you rinse and repeat, and you come up with the next prototype. But the key for me, at least, was that you're almost never, or you shouldn't really be, or in my case, I shouldn't really be modifying my set of hypotheses to solve every single problem. Instead, I've been focusing on basically picking a handful of essential issues to focus on, and then using those issues to guide the next prototype. So basically, to sort of like put this in more concrete terms, the game I've been working on for the last year and a half is called Antihero, and the initial design hypothesis was basically like, I think it would be fun to have an asynchronous multiplayer civilization game. So like sort of more succinctly, Civilization with Friends was like the elevator pitch. And I basically like made a small control group of playtesters, which were local game dev friends. And we would get together every 3 to 4 weeks and show off our prototypes, and whoever was showing a prototype, would basically like bribe the other people with pizza and beer or sandwiches and beer in order to get feedback. And what this meant was that essentially like my playtests were much more frequent than what I'd done at my paid job. And I'd also approach playtests with generally just a handful of primary hypotheses based on what I felt was broken or missing from the previous playtest. And essentially the net result of all of this was that I am having a much better sense of momentum, which is motivating. And also when I have a design problem that I don't know how to solve, I implement something and then essentially just trust in the process to have that something turn into some other insight that will eventually, in a roundabout way, hopefully either solve that design problem or obviate that design problem because it turns out like I should have been focusing on something else. And that is the end of the talk, except for this slide, which I'll skip because I think I just said all this stuff. And I just launched my Greenlight today, so I am just like humbly submitting myself to the crowd here. If you go to my website, antihero-game.com, antihero-game.com, then you can vote for my game on Greenlight. And it turns out, I guess, that having a video is really important for Greenlight, so I'm going to put that up tomorrow. Thank you.